This is TWiT.
So you have the Sony Xperia 1 2. What do you think? What are your thoughts? What is it best at, if you had to pick like a category that it excels at?
Yeah, so reviews going live in the next couple days, probably tomorrow or the next day. But what I really like about this phone, it's very hard to see because it's very
There we go. There's
shiny.
the Sony.
Got to get the angle, yeah. So the last Sony phone that I reviewed was the Xperia XZ2, and that was like some of the Sony phones that they tried to make like water, where they were like rounded, and they took out the headphone jack for some reason, even though they're Sony. And like the whole thing with Sony for me has been they're probably one of the most well-positioned corporate companies, conglomerates, to make a smartphone, because our smartphones have not necessarily replaced, but supplemented almost every electronic device that we have in our lives. They have their Bravia team for their TVs. They have their Alpha team for the camera. They've got all their headphones that they make. You know, it's like they're such a giant company, and they make top class stuff in every single category. Xperia XZ2 was really bad, in my opinion. Like, the camera was awful. It was a weird design. It didn't have a headphone jack. It just bothered me a lot. Xperia 1 Mark II, I think this is a fantastic phone. I will say, first of all. And you're asking me does it do best? I think just the general like use experience of the phone is really good. It's 21 by 9. Wow, that's blown out. Yeah, it's 21 by 9, which you do have to get used to a little bit at the beginning. But in my opinion, you get used to it really. Yeah, right. You get used to it really quickly, though, because like most phones are becoming like 20 by 9 or 20.5 by 9 at this point anyway. But I actually really like this narrow but also tall kind of design. What I like a lot about the UI is that they stripped almost all of their custom UI stuff, and it almost feels like Pixel UI. Like, it's just the most simplistic form of Android you can find. Like, all of the apps, all the default apps are just Google apps. Like on the bottom bar here, I didn't even change any of these. So you got Google Phone, Google Messages, Chrome, Google Photos, and then you can swipe left and you get the Google Feed, or it's not Google Now anymore, right? Google Feed. And settings are the same. So it's a trade-off, because the good part about that is that it's super simplistic. You don't have anything that you don't want necessarily. But the bad part about that is that things that Google still has not added yet, like built-in screen recording, you're also not getting, because they haven't really added much. But overall, I still really like the UI. That being said, using that kind of UI actually kind of unlocks the Snapdragon 865 a lot in this phone. We have a full like objective testing suite that we run a lot of benchmark stuff through. And this actually scored the highest in Gary Sims' Speed Test G, he's a very smart man who works for us. And it's scored as like the highest Android phone so far. And we'll get more into the Velvet later, but the 765G on the Velvet is a fine chip, but it's slow because LG's skin is so bad and so slow and so old. So anyway, back to Sony. The camera system. Very versatile, and I really like their color tuning, which is to say there isn't much color tuning, which I actually kind of like, because a lot of, Samsung or whatever will just like boost the saturation like crazy on everything. Sony doesn't really do a lot to what's coming in the sensor, and their whole point for this phone was, let's make an A9, which is their flagship sports wildlife camera, and let's put it in a phone. So in photography, there is three zoom lenses that they call the Holy Trinity. And that would be like 16 to 24, 24 to 70, and then a 70 to 200. And so they tried to mirror that in this system. So you've got a 24 millimeter lens, a 16 millimeter lens, a 24 millimeter lens, and a 70 millimeter lens. And you can kind of like zoom in between each of them. But they're not using their newest sensor that we saw in like the Oppo Find X2 Pro or the OnePlus 8 Pro. And the reasoning for that is because it's a very large sensor, and the bigger the sensor you put in a phone, the larger the image circle you have to be able to capture, and the more data comes through. And it's a 48 megapixel image. These are all 12 megapixel sensors, and they wanted to make this like the A9. And the A9's flagship feature is the fact that it can do 20 FPS raw burst mode shooting. So that's something that Sony is trying to bring with this phone. So, and it's actually pretty impressive. I've tested it quite a bit. It can do autofocus during every single one of those 20 frames, and it checks for focus 3 times per frame. So it's actually doing a focus acquisition / calculation 60 times per second, which is really impressive. There's pretty much no other phones that have done that. And the way they do that is they have actually put the DRAM chip directly against the sensor, which is what they do in the A9 as well to get that same capability. So overall, camera system is good. It's definitely not the best. There's better camera systems out there. Huawei's doing better. OnePlus and Oppo, who have the new Sony sensor that Sony won't use itself. It's really good. It's got really good white balance. But it's fine and it's versatile. I would prefer to have like telephotos and a wide and a standard lens over like something like a color pop camera or something anyway. So whatever that means. Love having the headphone jack. Obviously, like it was weird that they took that away considering it's Sony and they make some of the best headphones on the market. And that's just like nice to have. And then you can have FM radio and all this other stuff. Side mounted fingerprint reader is debatable for a lot of people. I've always liked it. They've always had that in Xperia phones basically forever. And then it's a 4K display. So that is, you could make whatever you want of it. It impacts the battery life a little bit, but it has a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, and I got about 6 hours of screen on time, and my average is about 6 hours. So it's not bad battery life. It's not insanely good, but if you put your eye right up to the display, you cannot tell individual pixels apart, which is actually surprising, because on 1080p phones and even on 2K displays or whatever you want to call it, you can definitely kind of see the pixels. So, I mean, it's a good display. It's it's a Bravia OLED 4K HDR 10-bit, all that stuff. So, that's about it. The front-facing camera is pretty horrible, but that's because the sensor is really, really small. But they did put these bezels on the front of the phone instead of doing a notch. And honestly, I really like it. The bezels are crazy thin. So I would, and this phone is $1,200. Personally, I would buy this over the Galaxy S20 Plus, which is also $1,200, just because I like so many things about this phone more. But a lot of people are going to debate that. So anyway, that's
that's a big statement.
5-minute elevator pitch. Yeah, I guess so.
I think a lot of people would go, oh, at least here in the U.S., Sony has had a history on this show where we want Sony phones and we show them, but then for whatever reason they don't get a whole lot of attention, a lot of traction in the U.S. For a long time, the Sony design aesthetic was just always felt really dated and same to itself. So I'm happy to see that Sony's kind of working out of that a little bit, because it's like, all right, here's another phone that looks just like the other Sony phones that have been released the past 4 years. This actually looks like a really nice phone. Looks like the display is a 60 hertz refresh rate. So when you're talking about these kind of higher range premium devices, now we're getting more and more used to the 90 hertz and 120 hertz. So that might be a little bit of a concession. They say that there's a motion blur reduction feature that I don't know if it simulates 90 hertz equivalents or what, but they're getting there somehow, sort of. But I don't know if it's
probably that frame interpolation thing that they put, the hardware encoding that they put to like get movies up to 60 hertz, and then it looks terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
So that they can say that they can get there, so that they can put that in the spec sheet and be like, oh, actually, asterisk 90 hertz, sort of. Yeah. But,
so when I had the briefing for this phone, I got to talk to the engineer who works on the Alpha team for the cameras, and I don't agree with the decision that they made to use the slightly smaller sensor than the one they have available. But I understand why they did it, because they really, really wanted to have that same 20 FPS burst mode than that they have in the A9, and so that's why they sacrificed a little bit of image quality and low light performance to be able to get that. And I think an issue that Sony phones have had in the past is that everyone's like, you're a giant company who has all these resources and they're some of the best on the market. Why aren't you making the best smartphones on the market? This feels to me like one of the first phones that they've actually brought in a lot of people from different teams and been like, okay, how can we make a good smartphone? So, yeah, I like it a lot.
Yeah. I mean, when you hold it up, it looks super slick and just so glassy. It looks like a really nice phone.
Where can you buy a Sony phone, and what networks does it work on in the US? This particular device.
This phone is available at the end of July, so I don't really know why they sent out a review unit so early. They have 5G disabled on this phone, and they won't tell me why. I keep asking them, and they've said, we don't know what we can tell you publicly, but it has something to do with the amount of rollout of 5G that has happened so far. And I don't know if that means that they're waiting for like Verizon to expand its millimeter wave coverage or what. But I know you can buy it from Sony directly, and probably at like Best Buy. They actually had a pretty good pre-order going on for a little bit, where if you bought the phone, you would also get their like $300 truly wireless headphones that are super good and have noise cancellation for free. But that was only through the end of June, and this phone doesn't release till the end of July, so probably a missed opportunity there. But
this is a common Sony problem. They've been doing this for years with the
But it's also, I mean, looking online, you can get it at Amazon, you can get it at B&H, you can get it direct from Sony. So like you can get it. It's expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 20 plus. I mean, yeah, it's $1,200 phone unlocked, right? That's pretty, I don't know, that's pricey.
It is.
I mean,
yeah, it's in the upper tier.
It's like, I feel like there was this quiet uptick of price through Samsung that nobody really discussed that much. Like the Galaxy S10 started at like $899, and then the Plus was the $999. But then this year, the smaller one was the $999, and the Plus was $1199, which is actually a $200 bump. So that's become like the norm, and I don't know if it's fair or not, but I usually use like Samsung's flagship as like a benchmark, because most regular people consider Samsung phones to be like Android's iPhone. They're a little like poster styled, so with the phone being, it's expensive, like you said, Ron, $1,200 for anybody to pay for a phone is ridiculously expensive, especially when almost any phone that has like 6 gigs of RAM can run Android fine now. But for what they're offering, like you have IP68 water resistance, you've got expandable storage. It's a 256 gigabyte storage phone with 8 gigs of RAM, dedicated shutter button, 3 cameras, 4,000 milliamp hour battery, 4K OLED display. Like usually phones have like one or two little trade-offs. Like the OnePlus 8 Pro doesn't have official certification, or it doesn't have a headphone jack. This has like everything. So I don't really know what else you could add in this except for better cameras that would make it. Yeah, and the camera's not bad. It's just like, I really would have liked them to use the Oppo Find X2 Pro's Sony sensor. But, maybe in the Xperia 1.3.
One Mark III.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get over the Xperia 1.2 as a name. That's whatever. But
1.25.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's funny because I always see these Sony phones at Best Buy. Like you can get them. I never see someone actually using them. I rarely ever see them in the wild, but they're out there, I suppose. Someone's paying
very popular in Japan. For this. They're very popular in Japan. Every time I've been there, I see a lot of Sony phones, and they do have SKUs that we don't have here, but they're actually a pretty popular phone company in Japan.
But I also feel like that's watching a K-drama and everybody's using a Samsung or an LG phone. You know what I mean? Like.
Yeah.
It's just Sony's always been this way. I don't know what it is. I don't know.
It is strange.
How long they can carry this.
Yeah, their mobile department has kind of always been just like, we should make one for a vanity project, I guess. They don't really treat it as like a main priority.
I'm just thinking like in the early 2000s, like getting a Sony product always required some sort of price hike. to get it because it was supposed to come with some sort of cachet, but I just feel like that doesn't really work for Sony in 2020.
Yeah,
it's true.